Welcome back to Government 148, Government and Politics of the Middle East. In the previous segment, I pointed out that that is the people in the West, in the United States, and almost everybody in the Western Hemisphere, not only we know very little about the Middle East and the peoples of the area, but what we know is often distorted and not quite infrequently stereotypical. Therefore, in today's lecture, what I want to do is to talk a little bit about the peoples of the Middle East. But before doing so, I think this is a good time to bring up a sensitive issue that often is confronted in a course like this. Now, I know that some of you have very strong attachment towards Arabs, toward Israel, toward Iran, and these are obviously natural sentiments and understandable. And students often ask me, and I think quite legitimately, whether I am pro-Arab, pro-Israel, pro-Iran. And my answer all the time is that I am pro-analysis. And by that I mean, when you think about it, I have asked you, if you recall from the beginning, to erase what you know. And mostly what I'm talking about, obviously, the stereotype images of the people and the area and the government that you have of the Middle East. And as political scientists, our job should be to be able to describe, to be able to explain, and to ultimately understand the peoples and their political behavior in the region. So we should be able to communicate both Israel's fears as well as Arabs and Muslims' rage. And certainly to resolve the conflict in the Middle East, we need to first understand the roots of these conflicts before we can seriously think about resolving them. Now, those of you who do have strong feeling about the Arabs and Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict or Iran and United States conflict, what I'm going to ask you is really to be as receptive and as empathetic as you can to kind of give up your dogmatism, at least for the duration of the course. You have the rest of your life to remain dogmatic if you want to be. And at the very least, think of it this way, that you're going to learn a lot more if you remain less defensive and trying to keep an open mind. And at the same time, you can always go back to where you were, except that now you will even have better argument to defend your position. So with that introduction said, let me now turn to a very broad categorization of the peoples of the Middle East. We're looking really at three great peoples and three major religions. All the three major religions are the Abrahamic religions, and the Christianity, Judaism, of course, and Islam. And the first group are the Indo-European people of the Middle East. And in that category, it's an important category because these were the people really that came from the Caucasus to the Middle East. So the term Caucasian comes from that area. And the first of that group are the Kurds. The Kurds are really the true Caucasians, and they are an important part of the Middle East. Their numbers are nowhere as large as the other groups that I'm going to talk about, but certainly well over 20-some million people. And we have learned a lot about, or heard a lot about, Kurds after the invasion of Iraq. So the Kurds are the first group in that, and then the second group are the Iranians and Persians. Iran comes from the name. Iran really goes back to the Aryan, the land of the Aryan, and the Aryan race, the Caucasian race, is related to Iran. For a long time it used to be called Persia, but in the last 70, 80 years it has become known by its Iranian name as Iran. I would have to include the Afghans. The Afghans are part of that. And the next group are the Tajiks. The Tajiks are Persian-speaking people in the former Soviet Union. They were part of the Republic of the Soviet Union. Now they're independent. And the other group are the Armenians, one of the most interesting people in the region. Armenia was really part of Iran until 1828, when Iran lost the control to Russia. And then the last group would be the Georgians. Georgia was, again, part of Iran until 1813. Tbilisi used to be the summer capital of the Persian kings. And these are, again, very interesting group of people. But notice several of these are part of the former Soviet Union. But nevertheless, in our categorization, I would put them in this category. Now, the next group are the Turkic people. And here there are two main categories. The Osmanli Turks, they are mostly in what we call today Turkey. And the second important group are the Azeri Turks. Azeri Turks are part of two provinces in the northwest of Iran, as well as, of course, the Republic of Azerbaijan, which used to be, again, part of Iran, but Iran lost it to advancing Russian Empire. The other group are the Turkmens and Uzbeks. During the Cold War, really we didn't study either Turkmens, Uzbeks at all, because as Middle Eastern expert, we kind of ceded that to the Soviet specialists. But by any stretch of imagination, they're part of the Middle East and they should be studied. But it goes to show how academic disciplines are, once they are congealed, it's very difficult to change them. So now they are studied by people who study Central Asia, so they're considered part of the Central Asia. Now, I mentioned the Soviet Union in this context for an important reason, because they are the Cold War manifestation. I mean, the fact that we don't study them is part of the Cold War manifestation. And I want to say that in that context, we constantly forget that the Soviet Union was a Middle East power. By any stretch of imagination, Middle East would be considered their backyard rather than ours. We're 7,000 miles away. It was convenient for us not to think of the Soviet Union as a Middle East power, because it made it easier for us to think of the Middle East as our vital interest. Now, today, as I said, these former Soviet republics are now mostly studied by people who specialize in the area called Area Studies, Central Asia Studies. But as I said, in any categorization of the Middle Eastern people, they certainly belong there. Now, the last groupings that I want to discuss are the Semitic people, and they comprise probably the largest group of people in the Middle East. By far the largest certainly are the Arabs, and if you include not just the Middle East but North Africa, there are close to 300 million Arabs in the world. And within the Arabs, there are three important subcategories. And these subcategories are as follows. The first one are the Assyrians. And the Assyrians used to have an empire, actually, in the Middle East, going back to circa 2000 before the Common Era. And a lot of them end up migrating to the United States. They're located mostly in Detroit and Toledo, Ohio, and in fact a sizable portion of them are in Turlock, California. These people think of themselves as being tied with Greater Syria, not today's Syria. That whole area used to be called Greater Syria. When we get to the discussion of that part of the world, you will see exactly how big that area was. And in this course, we're really not going to look at them. They're not a very sizable population, and they have been mostly assimilated throughout the world, although they have a very robust and strong sense of identity, but most of them know that they're not going to have their own state. The other group are the Egyptians, and here the question of how Arab is Egypt is really an interesting question, but the truth of the matter is that it's the least Arab in terms of its identity. Egyptian had an identity long before the Arabs really began to dominate their identity. And therefore, it should not be surprising that this was the very first state to make peace with Israel. And paradoxically, and this is one of those paradoxes that you find in the Middle East, is that Egypt happens to be also the hotbed of Arab nationalism at the same time. So Jamal Abdel Nasser, who was identified as the preeminent leader of Arab nationalism, was an Egyptian. When we talk with Egypt and we begin to discuss Nasser, you will see that I would argue that actually he was an Egyptian nationalist first and Arab nationalist second. But that's for much later. There are also a lot of blacks or Africans among the Egyptians. And so as far as the racial composition is concerned, they're a little bit different than the other Arabs. The third category or subcategory under the Arabs are the Berbers. Racially and linguistically, the Berbers are really not Semitic, but they have become absorbed and they have become part of that region. And they are mainly in Morocco and Algeria, and to a lesser extent, you also find them in Tunisia. Finally, the last group are the Hebrews. I've had some Jews objecting to this categorization, classifying them together with the Arabs. But a lot of Jews, Einstein certainly, I remember, viewed them as part of the Semitic people, the Arabs and the Jews as together part of the Semitic people. And again, remember, I'm not a cultural anthropologist to debate these things. And probably this is a good time to bring out an important question. Think of this: who is an Arab? After what I've said. The answer to that question is something that I hope you will discuss, but as a political scientist, I do have an answer. And the answer is simply, whoever perceives herself or himself as an Arab is an Arab. In other words, the political identity point is a perceptual point. If you see yourself as an Arab, you will behave as an Arab. If you perceive yourself as a Jew, you will behave as a Jew, and so forth. So the point that I want to emphasize is to call your attention to this notion of political identity, which for the political scientists is different than it is for other disciplines such as anthropology. Now I want to talk about the main linguistic group in the area. There are numerous languages spoken in the area with many dialects, but three are the main ones. These three are, of course, the first one being Arabic, spoken by the greatest majority in the region. And in that order, the next would be Turkish, and the last would be Persian. Persian, remember, it's an Indo-European language. It has the same kind of a degenerate grammar as English. So it's part of that group of languages. Now I want to really shift my topic a little bit and talk about something that is very important to this course, and that is to talk about development. In the second half of the 20th century, in the first part of that second half, there was a huge proliferation of literature dealing with development. Because development was a major concern at the end of World War II. A good part of the world was certainly economically and in many ways politically was behind the West. So in the 1950s and 1960s, those decades were dubbed by the United Nations as the decades of development. So the first part of the second half of the 20th century, 50s and 60s, there was so much talk about development. But in the 80s and beyond that, hardly anybody talked about development. So that puzzle needs to be thought about because it kind of concealed the changes that had taken place. So let's see if we can answer part of this puzzle. And ask yourself what development has come to mean to us, at least. Probably the best way I can capture that is by looking at this graph that I'm placing for you. Ask yourself what a developed society looks like. And you will see that the developmental theory goes something like this. You start out as a traditional society. As you go through the process of development, you become a transitional society, sometimes called developing society, and then the end point is modern developed state. Notice that if you ask yourself, what does a developed state look like? The common answer is, it looks like us. We are the model. And the base assumption is that they will begin to look like the United States, like Europe, Western Europe, and more recently you can add Japan to that category. Now, this view of development is a unilinear progression of change from where they are, or there used to be, traditional society to a modern one. And this is what I call the Amero-Eurocentric view of development. In other words, it's our perspective on how these quote-unquote backward people need to go through. We are the modern society and they are the underdeveloped backward societies, and the path to development is the one that we followed, and if they want to get there, they got to follow this path. Now, when you think about this, however, you will see that development is a culturally value-ridden concept. In other words, what we have is a kind of norm that we have experienced and we're familiar with, and we're now imposing on the rest of the world. So let me elaborate a little bit more on this point. And I am relying very much on a very interesting book by David Schaefer called The Deadly Paradigms. And that book is a telling critique of development theory, even though really the focus of the book is not on development. But it had a chapter on it that in one chapter he did a masterful job of exposing the underlying bedrock assumptions of development. And the phrase he uses is projective fallacy. And I like that term. And I'm going to quote directly from Schaefer. Quote, "Our experience describes the likely course others will follow." This is what he calls projective fallacy. We project our own experience into the world that is very different than us. If you follow the path of reasoning from projective fallacy, you will see that that would naturally lead to what he calls gap theory. And the gap theory essentially says there is a gap in development between the traditional societies and the advanced modern one. And so the implications are very clear. If you want to overcome The gap, you got to start looking and emulating, sometimes imitating the more advanced nation to be able to get there. So we become the end. And here you will see that by the time you go from what projective fallacy does is to allow description to morph into prescription. So there is a subtle slip from description to prescription. If you want to develop, there is one model, and that's the West and the United States, of course. If you don't follow that, what is the outcome? Well, we had a very famous Harvard political scientist telling us what the outcome is. His name was Samuel Huntington. He passed away, I think, last year. And he wrote an article called Political Development and Political Decay. So now you have the answer. If you don't follow the path that was the United States and the Western path, then you will be experiencing political decay. The assumption, of course, is that if you don't move in the direction of the West, you're decaying. So United States is development, Iran certainly a decay. And if you ask yourself, what is the difference between the developed and undeveloped, underdeveloped? The developed one are quote unquote, quote, civilized nations. And that word is very important because it brings to mind the British imperial motto. Their motto was, we are on a civilizing mission. And so did the French, mission civilisatrice. So that is a common thread to the Western approach to the understanding of these societies. What the development theory and development literature conceals is very important. And to better understand, to be able to see what is being concealed is going to be one of my tasks, and hopefully I can demonstrate this. Perhaps the best way to do this is to distinguish between quote unquote development versus change. And in that context, I would argue that the entire development literature, for the most part, if not all of it, is a kind of a value-ridden concept, because the term development is value-ridden term. It obviously reflects the values that have been achieved by a society. I'm not suggesting every part of that value is not worthy or not something that universally can be shared. But I'm saying that the package overall has to be viewed as value-ridden. It's not one thing, it's several things. And in that context, if you throw out this very notion of development and begin to think in terms of change, you will see that it really opens up a lot of possibilities. So this development business, the literature has been mostly self-serving. On the other hand, if you begin to focus on change, you will see that change can be value neutral in ways that development cannot be. And once you recognize that change is the name of the game, this is what has been happening, we're really talking about extremely rapid change in the context of history, in the context of change. You're talking about a generation in the Middle East, for example, dramatically changing. And most importantly, change is the characteristic of the region. Whereas if you stick with development, you would say development is not necessarily the characteristic of the region, very uneven. And change also shows you that it's going in many directions. It's not just one direction. Each country seems to be pursuing its own path. Neither the United States, Western Europe, Iran, nor Japan, nor China are serving as the sole model. So therefore, in this course, my focus is going to be on change, understanding change. and the type of change that are taking place. Obviously, as a political scientist, I'm going to be focusing only on political change, but also equally important is the direction of change. Which direction is it going? And as I said, these are very, very important topics. In fact, if I could perhaps surprise you a little bit, I've been talking about West not being the model, but at the same time, I want to tell you that there are patterns to the changes that are taking place. It's not a bunch of idiosyncratic phenomena that are taking place. There are patterns. And these patterns, believe it or not, are universal. In other words, it may seem contradictory to what I had said earlier, but the patterns of change, the phenomena that are changing, are universal. Europe went through them in the 18th and 19th century. The Middle East delayed that, entering that process, and started really going through it in large ways after World War II. The only exception in the Middle East was Turkey. Turkey went through that process earlier, right in the aftermath of World War I. But Turkey being the exception, and of course Israel is in a completely separate categories because these were immigrant people that came from very advanced European states. So we will spend quite a bit of time to talk about 4 universal patterns of change in the coming lectures. Now, going back to this point about the change, the question, of course, is what kind of a change are we talking about? And of course, my answer is, just judging by the title of the course, we're looking at political change. But then the question is, what kind of political change are we talking about in this context? Well, in this early part, since I dumped the idea of development and I'm focusing instead on change, the kind of change that I want to talk about has to do with a very, very critical transition that has occurred in Europe, that occurred in the United States, and is almost complete, perhaps even complete, in the Middle East. And that is a transition from what we would call pre-mass politics to mass politics. Now, that is not an easy idea to communicate or for audiences in this country to fully appreciate, because we have been living mass politics, so it's hard for us to relate to pre-mass politics. So I thought the best way I could give you an idea, a flavor of what life was in the pre-mass politics society, is to give you an anecdote that was told to me by my mentor, who was an American and who happened to be studying in Tehran University in Iran circa 1951, finishing up his dissertation. He was at Harvard and he was writing his dissertation in Iran, and there he was doing his research, and his research was on Iranian nationalism. He met a French sociologist who was doing rural research. And Dick, my advisor, my mentor, he didn't have much money or access to the region. So one day the French sociologist asked him, "Do you have some questions that I could ask for you while I go to these villages?" He said, "Yes, I do have some questions." And he gave her 3 questions so that she could go to the villages and ask the villagers. Now, before getting to the questions, I want to give you a bit of a background which is very pertinent to understanding the kind of questions, but even more importantly, the kinds of answer that you're going to hear. In 1951, Iran was very much alive. It was one of the most livelier period in the history of Iran, only to be superseded by the revolution in 1979. This was a time that under the leadership of Iranian Premier Mohammad Mossadegh, Dr. Mossadegh, Iran began to nationalize its oil, and it decided to take over the control of their natural resources from the British imperial control. So this period was a period of great excitement, especially in the capital and few cities. Now remember, 1951 is still, Iran was very much, 80-85% illiterate. So this time also coincided with the introduction of radio in Iran, and what happened in typical villages, there was a village radio where in the afternoon people go and listen to the news. During this period, when Iran was undergoing its struggle against the British imperial control of its oil, the airwaves were filled with anti-British speeches. So the villagers who were listening to all of these Iranian speeches and talks from the parliament, all they were hearing was very strong anti-British feeling. So the first question that Dick had told the French sociologist to ask was this: how do you like England? The answer: we despise it. Question number 2: where is England? Typical answer: it's over the mountains. My father went there, but I have not. Question number 3: what is England? Answer, typical answer: it's a very evil place. Maybe it's Tehran, the capital. Now, the association with Tehran capital should give you a clue how little these people knew about the world geography or great powers. They had a terrible relation with capital because typically the rural police would come to these villages, wanted to collect taxes, they wouldn't want to pay, so they would steal their chicken or their crop, and so they had a terrible relations with the central government. But these people were pretty autonomous, very little contact, autonomous in the sense that they knew very little about the central government, and only when soldiers would show up trying to collect money. So the point is that these people had no idea about the international power. The terms we use to describe this type of people is politically unaware. And this kind of unawareness, not knowing who is in charge, not knowing where is the central government, not knowing anything about the lay of the land as far as the geography is concerned, is a central characteristic of pre-mass political societies. And what I want to do is to at least give you some sense that this was not unique to Iran. So what I'm going to do is next to show you a passage by a traveler in France back in 1837 describing the villages there. So let me switch to this. So the pre-mass politics, the change that I was talking about, is pretty much reflected here. So the phenomena is the transition from pre-mass politics to mass politics. And now let me give you the quote. A characteristic of pre-mass politics in Europe: each village is still a little world which differs from the neighboring world as Mercury does from Uranus. Each village is a clan, a kind of a state with its own patriotism. There are different types at every step, different opinions, prejudices, and customs. And that very well would describe an Iranian village. So when I tell you about the universal patterns, this is the kind of things that I'm talking about. Now, we have talked a lot about development. So let me now point out, in my view, what is the real gap. The real gap separating the so-called developed countries, the advanced industrial countries, from the so-called developing, at the heart of it is technology. Remember what technology is. Technology is applied science. And so in order to have applied science, you need to have science, good science. And that has been lacking. I always get a lot of flack from Middle Easterners for underestimating their contribution to science. I'm not. What I'm emphasizing is the distinct characteristic of modern science, which for the most part was really absent in the Middle East. Let me quote from and put it in the form of a proposition by a well-known philosopher of science, Alex Rosenberg. He says, "Science arguably is," and here's the beginning of the quote, "the only feature of Western cultural achievement universally accepted by every society capable of accepting it." You have to be capable. You have to have universities, you have to have a literate population to take advantage of science. But very few would argue about that. So again, you will see that science is a very, very important phenomena, and what it gives you is applied science, technology, and when you have technology, you can develop your power. And when you develop your power, you can begin to assert your role in the world. So the real gap between the developed and underdeveloped lies in technology or lack thereof.